In 1995, a 24-year-old immigrant with almost no money and a thick South African accent walked away from a PhD at Stanford after just 2 days. Everyone around him thought he was throwing his future away. That single decision, made in less than 48 hours, became the first domino in a chain of choices that would eventually make him one of the richest human beings to ever exist. This is the story of the 7 decisions that turned Elon Musk into a billionaire. And, more importantly, this is the story of why each of those decisions worked, because understanding the reasoning behind them matters far more than just memorizing the timeline of his life. Before we go further, I want you to ask yourself something honestly. How many times in your own life have you had a moment where the safe choice and the risky choice were sitting right in front of you, and you picked the safe one without even really considering the alternative? Keep that question in mind, because Musk's entire story is built on consistently picking the uncomfortable option, again and again, for nearly 3 decades. Let's start at the beginning, because his early life actually explains a lot about why he became someone willing to take these kinds of risks in the first place. Musk was born in Pretoria, South Africa, in 1971, into a complicated and often difficult household. His parents divorced when he was young, and by his own accounts in later interviews, his childhood involved a lot of isolation. He was bullied severely at school, badly enough that he was once hospitalized after being beaten so badly he had to be pushed down a flight of stairs by other students. Instead of socializing the way most kids did, he retreated into books, often reading for 10 hours a day, devouring science fiction, encyclopedias, and computer programming manuals. By age 12, he had taught himself to code well enough to build a simple video game called Blastar, which he sold to a computing magazine for roughly $500. That's worth pausing on for a second, because it tells you something important. Long before any billion-dollar company existed, the core pattern was already there. Teach yourself something difficult, build something tangible from it, and find a way to extract value from that creation, even if the value at the time was tiny. At 17, Musk made a decision that most people overlook when they tell this story, but it's actually critical. He left South Africa entirely, alone, moving first to Canada and eventually to the United States, specifically because he believed the opportunities available in America, particularly in technology and business, were on a completely different scale than what was available to him at home. He has said in interviews that staying in South Africa would have meant mandatory military service in a system he fundamentally disagreed with. But beyond that, he simply believed the ceiling for ambition was higher elsewhere. This wasn't a comfortable decision. He arrived with very little money, working odd jobs including cleaning out grain silos and chopping wood on a relative's farm, just to survive while putting himself through school. So here's decision number 1, and I want you to really sit with this one. Musk chose discomfort and uncertainty in a foreign country over comfort and predictability at home, based purely on a belief about future opportunity that he couldn't actually prove yet. This is the first time in the story where you see the core trait that defines almost everything that follows: a willingness to bet heavily on an unproven belief about the future, even when the present reality offers no concrete evidence that the bet will pay off. He eventually earned degrees in physics and economics from the University of Pennsylvania, and in 1995, he was accepted into a PhD program in applied physics at Stanford, specifically focused on energy storage and capacitors, technology that, interestingly, would later become relevant to both Tesla and SpaceX. But this is where decision number 2 happens, and it's one of the most famous moments in his early career. The internet was just beginning to explode in the mid-1990s. Musk looked at what was happening: the early growth of the World Wide Web, the obvious gold rush forming around it, and made an immediate calculation. He believed the window of opportunity to build something significant in this space was narrow, and that spending years finishing a PhD meant potentially missing it entirely. So, after only 2 days of attending Stanford, he dropped out. Think about how that decision would have looked to his parents, his professors, basically everyone around him at the time. A promising physics PhD at one of the best universities on Earth, abandoned in 48 hours, to chase an idea about computers connecting to each other that most traditional business people in 1995 considered a passing fad. This is exactly the kind of decision that looks completely insane in the moment, and only looks brilliant in hindsight, which is precisely why almost nobody is willing to actually make decisions like this when it counts. With his brother Kimball, Musk started a company called Zip2, essentially an early online business directory and mapping service, sort of a primitive combination of Yellow Pages and Google Maps before either of those concepts fully existed. They worked brutal hours, often sleeping in the office because they couldn't afford separate housing, showering at a local YMCA. In 1999, Compaq acquired Zip2 for roughly $307 million. Musk's personal share was about $22 million. Now, here's where most success stories would tell you the person retired comfortably, maybe bought a nice house, invested conservatively, and lived off the interest for the rest of their life. That's the rational, safe thing to do with $22 million at 27 years old. Instead, Musk made decision number 3, and this is genuinely one of the most aggressive financial moves in modern business history. He put roughly $10 million of his own money directly into founding a new company called X.com, an online banking startup, which would eventually merge with a competitor to become PayPal. He didn't diversify. He didn't spread his risk across safe investments. He took almost half of his entire net worth and bet it directly on a single, unproven idea in an industry, online banking, that most traditional financial institutions thought was reckless at best. This is worth pausing on because I want you to genuinely consider something. If you suddenly had $22 million at 27, would you have the conviction to put $10 million of it directly back into another risky startup? Most people, even ambitious ones, would never make that choice. Musk did, and it would happen again, multiple times throughout his career, each time with even higher stakes. PayPal eventually merged with its main competitor, and after some serious internal corporate drama, including Musk briefly being removed as CEO while on his honeymoon, the company was sold to eBay in 2002 for $1.5 billion in stock. Musk's share came out to roughly $180 million after taxes. This brings us to decision number 4, and honestly, this is the decision that most clearly defines who Elon Musk actually is as a business person, more than any other single choice in his entire career. With $180 million, Musk could have lived an extraordinarily comfortable life simply managing that wealth conservatively for the rest of his existence. Instead, within a single year, he had put roughly $100 million into founding SpaceX, an aerospace company attempting to build rockets capable of dramatically reducing the cost of space travel, an industry where literally no private individual had ever successfully built a serious rocket company before. And he didn't stop there. In that same general period, he also invested around $70 million into a struggling electric car startup called Tesla Motors, taking a position as chairman and eventually CEO. Let that sink in for a second. By 2008, Musk had effectively bet almost his entire personal fortune, the complete proceeds from both Zip2 and PayPal combined, across two industries that conventional wisdom considered nearly impossible to succeed in. Private spaceflight had bankrupted virtually everyone who had previously attempted it. Electric vehicles had been tried by major automakers for decades and consistently failed to gain meaningful traction. This is exactly where decision number 4 nearly destroyed everything. By late 2008, both companies were simultaneously on the verge of complete collapse. SpaceX had experienced 3 consecutive rocket launch failures, an almost unthinkable failure rate that had drained the company's remaining capital. Tesla, hit hard by the global financial crisis, was within days of being unable to make payroll. Musk was reportedly down to his very last few $1 million. Personally, after pouring essentially everything he had into keeping both companies alive simultaneously. Here's a question worth genuinely sitting with. At that exact moment, with both companies seemingly failing at the same time and his personal fortune nearly gone, what would you have done? Most rational financial advisors would have told him to cut his losses immediately, save whatever capital remained, and walk away from at least one of the two companies to protect what little money he had left. This leads directly to decision number 5, arguably the highest stakes gamble of his entire career. Rather than abandoning either company, Musk made the fourth SpaceX rocket launch happen using essentially the last available resources the company had, while simultaneously scraping together a final, desperate round of funding for Tesla, reportedly closing the Tesla funding round on the very last day before the company would have run out of cash entirely, hours before bankruptcy. The fourth SpaceX launch succeeded. It was the first time a privately funded liquid-fueled rocket had ever successfully reached orbit. That single successful launch secured a massive NASA contract worth $1.6 billion, instantly transforming SpaceX from a company on the brink of death into a serious, credible aerospace contractor. If that fourth launch had failed, by Musk's own public statements, SpaceX would have ceased to exist entirely. There would be no Starlink, no reusable rockets landing themselves vertically on drone ships. None of it. The entire future of the company hinged on one single rocket launch, funded with money that genuinely should not have existed if any previous decision in this entire chain had gone differently. Now let's talk about decision number 6, because this is where business strategy, not just raw risk tolerance, really starts to matter. Once Tesla survived its near-death experience in 2008 and 2009, Musk made a series of strategic decisions that fundamentally reshaped how the entire automotive industry would eventually approach electric vehicles. Rather than trying to immediately mass-produce an affordable electric car, which is what most competitors assumed would be the logical first move, Tesla deliberately started with an extremely expensive, low-volume product, the original Roadster, specifically targeting wealthy early adopters who could absorb the inevitably high costs and rough edges of brand-new, unproven technology. This strategy, often referred to internally as moving from low-volume, high-margin products toward eventually mass-market, high-volume products, allowed Tesla to fund its own technological development without needing to immediately compete on price against established automakers with massive existing infrastructure. By the time the more affordable Model 3 launched years later, Tesla had already built an enormous amount of battery technology expertise, manufacturing experience, and, crucially, brand desirability, something competitors entering the electric vehicle space later would struggle enormously to replicate. A similar pattern emerges at SpaceX. Rather than competing directly against established aerospace giants on government contracts using their existing playbook, Musk pushed an obsessive focus on rocket reusability, an idea most established aerospace companies had previously dismissed as either technically impossible or simply not worth the engineering investment. Building rockets that could land themselves and be reused dramatically reduced launch costs over time, eventually allowing SpaceX to underbid nearly every competitor on the planet for commercial and government launch contracts, not through cutting corners, but through genuine structural cost advantages that took years of deliberate engineering investment to achieve. But no story like this is complete without acknowledging genuine mistakes. And this is exactly where we get to decision number 7. Except this one isn't really a triumph, it's a cautionary lesson. In 2018, Musk publicly tweeted that he had secured funding to take Tesla private at $420 per share, a claim that turned out to be, at best, dramatically premature, and at worst, simply untrue at the time it was stated. This single tweet triggered a massive Securities and Exchange Commission investigation, ultimately resulting in significant financial penalties for both Musk personally and for Tesla as a company, along with Musk being forced to temporarily step down as chairman of Tesla's board. This moment matters enormously for understanding the full picture, because it reveals something important about Musk's risk tolerance. The exact same impulsive, high-conviction decision-making that built SpaceX and Tesla from near collapse also created genuinely serious legal and financial consequences when applied carelessly to public statements about a publicly traded company. The trait that built his fortune and the trait that nearly created serious legal trouble for him are, in many ways, the exact same underlying trait, expressed in two very different contexts. So, what can we actually learn from these 7 decisions, beyond simply admiring the outcome? The first lesson is that genuine conviction, the kind that leads to life-changing outcomes, almost always looks reckless or even foolish in the moment it's actually being made. Nobody watching Musk drop out of Stanford after 2 days, or invest $10 million into an unproven online banking startup, or pour his entire PayPal fortune into rockets and electric cars simultaneously, thought these were obviously brilliant moves at the time. They only became brilliant in retrospect after years of difficult, uncertain execution that could have just as easily ended in complete failure. The second lesson is that diversification, while genuinely wise for most people building long-term financial security, was specifically not the strategy that created this particular level of extreme wealth. Musk concentrated his resources repeatedly, betting heavily on a small number of convictions rather than spreading risk broadly. This is an important distinction, because it's not necessarily advice that applies safely to everyone's individual financial situation, but it does explain the actual mechanism behind how this specific kind of outlier wealth gets created. The third lesson is that surviving near failure repeatedly, not avoiding failure entirely, but specifically surviving it when it does inevitably happen, is what separates extraordinary outcomes from ordinary ones. Both Tesla and SpaceX came devastatingly close to total collapse multiple times, and the actual skill being demonstrated wasn't avoiding those crises altogether, it was finding a way to survive them when they arrived, often through incredibly narrow margins that could have just as easily gone the other way. So here's a genuine question worth reflecting on as we wrap up this story. If you had been Elon Musk in late 2008, watching both of your companies simultaneously approach bankruptcy, having already spent nearly your entire personal fortune trying to keep them alive, would you have found a way to scrape together one final attempt? Or would you have walked away to protect whatever money you had left? There's no universally correct answer here, and that's exactly the point. The decisions that create this kind of extreme outcome require accepting a level of risk that most rational, careful people would correctly choose to avoid in their own lives. If this breakdown of the real decisions behind Elon Musk's wealth gave you a new way of understanding how outlier success actually gets built, hit that subscribe button right now, because Billion Dollar Stories breaks down exactly these kinds of decisions, the real strategy and risk behind every major billionaire story, every single week. Let me know in the comments which of these 7 decisions you found the most surprising, and which one you think you genuinely could have made yourself if you'd been in that exact position. Like this video if you made it all the way through, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and we'll see you in the next one.